Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My name's Tom Ford, and I'm one of the chairs of Grand Rounds, along with Leslie Crichton, who can't be here today because she's on call for high dependency, she tells me. So she's busy working whilst we're looking forward to today's Grand Rounds. So I'm very pleased to welcome two speakers today. Professor Sally Ibbotson, who's the head of the Photobiology Unit, as you can see on the screen just now, and then Dr. Ewan Eadie, who's the head of scientific services in the same Photobiology Unit. So they're from the dermatology overarching team. They're not here to talk about skin particularly, but they're here to talk about the Photobiology Unit and what it does, which is a wide-ranging set of services, including photodynamic therapy, which we are a centre of excellence for, which is perhaps not so widely known about. And then after Sally's spoken about the unit, Ewan's going to talk to us about the utility of UV light in the disinfection or into relating to COVID. So that's going to be something very interesting. And I have said the magic word of COVID. We are back talking about COVID a bit, but that's the way things are. So I'll shut up, and I think we're going to start off with Sally first, and then move on to you. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box along the side. If at the end, if you want to turn your camera on and ask the question in person, that's great. If not, I'll read them out. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you've both got to say. So thanks very much.
Yes, well, thanks very much for having us at Grand Round. And before we move on to the sort of focus of the presentation and Ewan's talk on UVC and COVID, I thought I'd just give a little bit of background about the Photobiology Unit and who we are, where we are and what we do really. And so we're very much an integral part of the general dermatology department. But we're quite a sort of multidisciplinary team with, NHS and university staff members and clinicians and scientists, clinicians, nurses, allied healthcare professionals, and we all work in the same unit. So, which is, a particular advantage. Could we move on, Ewan, to the next slide? And actually, we're fascinated by anything to do essentially with light and skin, so the interactions between light and skin, and it is very multidisciplinary. So it involves obviously photomedicine, but photophysics is really sort of inextricably linked into it, along with photobiology and photochemistry. And we have a particular interest in ultraviolet light, but also do use visible light in a variety of ways to treat certain skin conditions. If you could move on, Ewan. So this is a sort of deliberately messy slide just to show that sunlight does lots of things. And in terms of sort of harmful effects, you'll obviously be aware of skin cancer, which is a big part of what both ourselves and Photobiology and we do in general dermatology. We run the sort of national service for photodiagnostics, the Scottish Photobiology Service. So one of our sort of core clinical activities is investigating patients with abnormal light sensitivity diseases. And in addition, we do quite a lot of academic work in photodiagnostics, including sort of photo safety evaluation of any new drugs coming to market that have potential sort of light sensitizing adverse effects. On the other hand, however, we also use light to both diagnose and treat disease, and actually a variety of different types of light-based therapies, which include UV light-based therapies for treating things like eczema, psoriasis, which are extremely common, through to actually photodynamic therapy, where we're treating certain types of skin cancer and pre-cancer. And importantly, actually, a lot of our sort of academic efforts have been in terms of trying to enable some of these treatments to be done by the patient at home in terms of sort of patient-centered care. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So these are our sort of, in a nutshell, some of our particular areas of academic interest at the moment. As I mentioned, sort of photodiagnostics, there's lots happening in LED developments and using those in photodiagnostics, and we've got ongoing research studies of that. And then moving both photodynamic therapy and UV phototherapies into the home-based setting. And we do collaborative work with the university and other collaborators in terms of progressing those areas. A lot of our home-based treatments have been informed through our sort of public and patient engagement work. And so we do a lot of sort of research and and teaching. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm mentioning that is actually to raise awareness of our unit. So for anybody who has any interest or any particular questions about light, whether or not it's related to skin, we're very open and happy to discuss collaborations, offer advice, etc. So please do keep us in mind. And then obviously the area of UVC and COVID, which Ewan is going to go into a lot of detail in a moment. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So our sort of key areas of sort of activity, as I say, is particularly taking daylight PDT into the home setting. And we've worked with industry in our research collaborations to develop an app for home-based treatment, and also we're developing home-based kits in conjunction with art and design student, which has been successful this year. But to turn really to the main focus of today, I'd just like to introduce Dr. Ionidi, who is our sort of head of scientific services in the Photobiology Unit, and we've been really delighted to recently find out just earlier this month that we were awarded funding to take this work forward through the Department of Health and Social Care on the area of UVC for COVID-19 disinfection. And we're even more delighted that Ewan's recently been awarded an NRS fellowship actually to further this work on. So we've done some preliminary pilot work, and then we're going to progress this on further through the grant and through the fellowship. And I'm delighted that Ewan's going to talk further about this. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. And just as a sort of wee plug, actually, this is one of our sort of outputs, this year that which is free to sort of download and get a copy available, the Wee Discovery Book of Photodynamic Therapy. So for anybody who'd like to get a sort of flavour of some of the activities and work we've been doing, this relates to photodynamic therapy, then please feel free to access this through this link. And I'm going to turn now really to Ewan, who's going to move on to the sort of main thrust of the talk about UVC and COVID disinfection. Thanks, Ewan.
Thanks very much, Sally, and thank you for Tom for allowing us this opportunity to share the details of our research with you today. So for the next sort of 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be presenting on ultraviolet light for air disinfection of SARS-CoV-2. Now, I've got a couple of sort of interactive bits to involve you with this. So just so we can kind of get started and I can check that everything's working okay. If you do have a web browser that you can open or on your mobile phone, and if you could go to menti.com, and when you get there, use the code 74341604. Hopefully, you should see this question appear. Excellent, great. Well, it's working because we've got the first answer come in. So just trying to figure out how many are able to access the system, because I mean, part of this presentation, what I'm really interested in is your opinion on the UVC technology. So there's a couple of questions coming up later on that have that. Okay, good. Okay, there's a good number of people, and obviously people are still being able to log in at the moment and vote as well. There are no right or wrong answers to this. Of course, all the kittens are incredibly cute, and I don't think there's a particular standout winner from any of it. Okay, great. We're going to move on to the next slide. So this is kind of the structure of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'd just like to start by explaining a little bit about what ultraviolet light is used for, which part of ultraviolet light is used for air disinfection, what it actually does to the viruses and the bacteria. And then I'm going to sort of focus on the new and exciting technology that's called far UVC, and that's where our research is focused. The technology is exciting because it would appear that it can inactivate viruses, but not harm people. So in theory, it could be shining down on us like a standard light bulb, disinfecting the air as we breathe it out and before others breathe it in. Now, of course, it's not that straightforward, but that's a good starting point for us. Just to start with a couple of sort of disclosures, I have no conflicts of interest to declare for the presentation, but I would just like to thank all the companies that have provided their ultraviolet systems for use in this research so far. The systems have all been donated or loaned to us for free, and they don't have any influence on the research that we perform. So this is the first part where I'd like to really get some information from yourselves as to what you already know about ultraviolet light. So this is an open question, free text answer. And if you could just pop in a couple of words, things that you associate with ultraviolet light, just so that I can get a feel for the types of things that that you associate with ultraviolet light. It's still at the same location. It's still menti.com, and the code 74341604. So if you were able to log in before, you should be able to access it as well. So that's great. We're getting some answers coming up, which is great. Okay, so I mean, phototherapy is obviously one that which is coming out. It's great to see that. People obviously aware of the use of phototherapy. Sunburn, that's obviously a lot of people of you are picking up on that, and skin cancer. So some of the negative sides of ultraviolet light. I did see nightclub in there, which is, yeah, I'm not sure. I might actually go back to a nightclub if they open up again, just to try and remember what it was actually like. But it seems like from the answers that have come in so far, phototherapy, sunburn, and skin cancer are the ones that dominate. And that's kind of obviously when we think of ultraviolet light, we do tend to think of the sun as our biggest source of ultraviolet, of UV radiation, and it's the sun's UV rays that are responsible for that sunburn, that play the role in skin cancer, in skin aging, in snow blindness, cataracts. But as the answers previously highlighted, it isn't all negative. UV from the sun is our biggest source of vitamin D, and we harness the UV in the hospital to treat skin conditions like psoriasis and atopic eczema. You might also be aware that UV is split into different categories called UVA, UVB, and UVC. So UVA and a little bit of UVB penetrates through our atmosphere and reaches us here on Earth, but UVC from the sun is completely absorbed. So we don't have any natural source of UVC radiation, but we do have a number of artificial sources of UVC radiation, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And the focus really is on UVC because it's the UVC that can inactivate the viruses and the bacteria. We will often describe UV radiation in terms of its wavelength, and the area of interest for us today is wavelengths between 200 and 280 nanometers. So it's that part of the spectrum there. So I guess the first question probably to ask is how effective is UVC at inactivating viruses and bacteria? Well, we've known about the germicidal properties of UVC since the 1870s, so well over 100 years. And actually, it's a well-established technology and is already extensively used, particularly when it comes to water disinfection. It is also actually commonly used for surface decontamination, including in some UK hospitals. When it's used to inactivate or decontaminate surfaces, though, the early learning from some of the hospital studies was that UVC was most effective when it was in addition to the standard cleaning procedures, and it wasn't a replacement, which is sometimes how it's sold. However, I'm not going to be talking about water. I'm not going to be talking about surfaces. I'm going to be talking about UVC instead for air disinfection. Now, back in the late 1930s, in suburban Philadelphia schools, there was a study which looked at UVC air disinfection. And you can see these are the air disinfection units, which are up on the top of the wall of the classroom there. And the UVC was shown to reduce the transmission of measles, which I understand is currently the most infectious disease there is, within our number of about 15 if there are no control measures. Now, in the classes that didn't have the UVC, there was an average of 54% of the children that contracted measles, whereas in the rooms with UVC, it was only 13%. And then in a similar study during an influenza pandemic in 1957, hospital wards with UVC air disinfection had an average infection rate of 2%, whereas those without UVC had an average infection rate of 20%. So UVC can clearly work to reduce the transmission of airborne pathogens. And the technology that was used in those studies is what's called upper room UVC. And it's designed so that the UVC is present only in the upper part of the room above head height. And the theory is that as you breathe out, that warm air rises in the room, that it passes through the UV beam, gets decontaminated, and then as it cools, it drops to the ground again. If you're not getting that air mixing in a room, it's fairly straightforward just to put a low velocity fan in place, and that will also do the air mixing that's required. The particular UVC that's used in that upper room technology emits a wavelength at 254 nanometers. And we know the reason that it's limited to the area above head height is we know that at 254 nanometers, that ultraviolet radiation will cause a painful sunburn reaction in the skin and a photokeratitis in the eye if somebody gets exposed to it. And the way the UVC works to inactivate the DNA, inactivate the viruses, is that it damages the DNA or the RNA. It breaks it has enough energy to break the hydrogen bond that holds the base pair together, which then causes cross-linking. And as it's that DNA, RNA that's responsible for the virus replication, damage to those critical parts means that it can't replicate anymore. And UV works well on almost all viruses and bacteria. But of course, the main one at the moment and the one of greatest concern is SARS-CoV-2. So the question is, does it work for this virus? And the answer is yes, it does. So in this study by Healing Low, they irradiated the SARS-CoV-2 virus with the same 254 nanometer UVC that's used in upper room technology and achieved a 6 log reduction for a dose of UVC of about 1,000 millijoules per centimeter squared. So if we then take that historical evidence that upper room UVC is effective when reducing transmission of airborne diseases such as influenza and measles, and add that evidence that it also inactivates SARS-CoV-2, also add in the evidence that we know that the aerosols are a transmission route for COVID, that all indicates that upper room UVC should be an effective control measure for COVID-19. But given that we're only sort of 10 minutes into this presentation, I'm probably expecting some big reveal as to how upper room UVC isn't, there's some big problem with it that means it's not any good, but there is no big problem with it. There's nothing wrong with upper room UVC. It would work very well. It simply fell out of favor. It was beginning to find traction in the 1940s until the vaccines came along, and then interest in it almost completely disappeared. There was a wee bit of a resurgence in interest in it in the 1980s because of drug-resistant tuberculosis. But really, that's the niche that the upper room UVC has stayed in. It's found common use in countries where there is a high TB burden. But here in the UK, for example, one of the major UK manufacturers told me that they stopped their production of upper room UVC systems in 2012 due to a lack of commercial interest. Of course, there is a lot of commercial interest now, but not enough manufacturers or installers in order to meet the demand. If there is sort of any issue at all with upper room UVC, then it's that these systems are not maintained, if these systems are not maintained or installed properly, then there's a potential that you could expose somebody in the lower part of the room to the UVC radiation. And then that would go on to cause the sort of skin and eye problems that I've previously mentioned. Now, historically, that's really rare, but it is still a consideration. One sort of potential solution to that is the technology that we're currently researching at the moment, and that's been called Far UVC, which generally encompasses wavelengths between 200 and 230 nanometers. Now, at the moment, the most common source of Far UVC is the krypton chloride excimer lamp that you can see sort of circled on the slide here. Now, the hypothesis is that Far UVC is as effective at inactivating viruses as the 254 nanometer UVC, but because of its shorter wavelength, it doesn't penetrate as far into the skin or the eyes, and instead gets absorbed in the stratum corneum and in the tear layer. So it would appear to be less hazardous, but just as effective as conventional UVC. So what this means, so in theory, that UVC would no longer need to be above head height. It could actually be pointed downwards into the room, illuminating the room below. And you can see that this is already happening. These Far UVC devices are already being used in some businesses in the USA and elsewhere. These 4 circles here show you these Far UVC systems. They actually have some visible white light around the outside of them, and it's the square in the center of the lamp that's emitting the UVC, which is of course invisible. It can't be seen by the human eye. And it's still a relatively new technology. It doesn't really have a sort of strong real-world evidence base. There is laboratory evidence as to how effective it is. So it has been shown to inactivate SARS-CoV-2 on a surface with a sort of 99.7% reduction in viral load with a dose of just 3 millijoules per centimeter squared. And it's also been shown to inactivate aerosolized influenza and aerosolized human coronaviruses, not the SARS-CoV-2, but other human coronaviruses. So it would appear to kind of work well in the lab, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the real world. And as you can imagine, it's a little bit difficult to do real world studies. They're not entirely straightforward because we can't just go and release an airborne virus into a coffee shop and then try and observe what happens. So one way around that is to create computer simulations. They're a sort of useful alternative. And our collaborators at the University of St Andrews, along with a local company called Fluid Gravity Engineering, have adapted their computer models, which were originally developed for astronomy and for fluid dynamics, and have applied them to this typical class-sized room, which is actually based on an actual room, tutorial room that's at the University of St Andrews. And in their simulations, using data from real sort of commercial Far UVC systems and assuming that there's a continual viral release in the room, they found that Far UVC at the sort of current legal limits for exposure would allow a 50% reduction in the viral load within the room. Interestingly, the upper room UVC system actually performs a bit better than that. And that had a sort of 65% reduction in viral load. I should also say that this simulation was for a room that has good ventilation. So the room that this was modeled on has 6 air changes per hour, which is a relatively well ventilated room. The effect of the UV is far more dramatic if you have a poorly ventilated room, because obviously natural ventilation isn't removing some of that virus. If the current legal exposure limits for Far UVC were allowed to be increased by a factor of 20, and there's good reason to think that that might happen in the future, then for this simulation, there would show that there would then be an 85% reduction in the viral load in the room. And if we were to increase the exposure limits by a factor of 100, then that would result in a 97% reduction in viral load. If you're interested in the simulations, because I'm not going to go into them in any more detail, but if you're interested in those simulations, then if you follow the YouTube link, there's a video from my colleague, Dr. Kenny Wood, explaining a bit more. There are a couple of caveats to the simulations. Whilst they're very promising, in order to cover this room, which was 12 meters long by 6 meters wide by 3 meters high, that required 18 far UVC lamps. And now a cost of roughly £500 to £1,000 per lamp. It's very, very expensive for just one room. We have also been told that these systems have a short lifetime at the moment, so they only last about 1 to 2 years if they're operated continuously, which again makes it very expensive. And so maybe at this point in time, with the technology that's available right now, the upper room UVC, which was just a single unit in this simulation, seems to be a better, more cost-effective measure. However, it is worth remembering that far UVC is a new technology. The price should drop dramatically as manufacturing increases, and there are rapid advancements in the technology, so they'll also increase the lifetime of the lamp systems as well. And the sort of final caveat on it is that, of course, it is a simulation. And whilst we make every effort to replicate real life, it can't exactly replicate the complex and evolving and changing particle movements in a room. So an experimental replication of the real world is needed. And that's what we've fortunately been funded to do, as Sally said, funded by the Department for Health and Social Care as part of the NHS Test and Trace Innovation Programme. And with a sort of collaboration of various partners, we're going to investigate the inactivation capabilities of this far UVC technology in a controlled room-sized aerosol chamber down at the University of the Leeds. So we're going to release aerosolized bacteria, aerosolized viruses into this room and look at what the viral load is, both with and without the far UVC lamps being activated. So I thought I'd maybe just stop and break there for just a second and come back to because I'm interested in your opinions on what you think of the efficacy from what you've heard so far. We're going to go on and talk about safety after this, but just in terms of efficacy, do you think that yes, both one or both of these technologies would work if it was installed properly? Or do you think, well, it might do, but there's really not enough direct evidence yet, and so you'd want to see more studies done? Or no, unlikely to reduce the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 because really SARS isn't airborne, you don't think, or transmission would predominantly happen in an area where the technology couldn't be installed, or for any other reason to that matter? Well, that's very, very encouraging so far. That's great. So it's good to hear that, I guess 3/4 of you think that it would reduce transmission, and about 1/4 think, yeah, it might do, but we need to see more studies. There's no wrong or right answer. I'm just really interested in the opinions of you. So thank you very much for answering that. So if we move on then to safety. So in that last question, I said not to think about safety because that's what we're going to sort of come on and consider. And the safety of conventional UVC of the 254 nanometers, that's very well established. And as we found out earlier on, it's been used for more than 100 years. We know that if you get exposed to it, you're going to have that painful erythema and photokeratitis. And if you search the internet, you will find plenty of examples of where that has happened, including actually in a hotel in Scotland, maybe about 20 years ago. Now, as far as we're aware, those issues only occur when there's been poor installation of the UVC, or one of the sort of fail-safe measures in the system hasn't functioned properly. So, and it's also important to state that those effects, although painful, they generally are transient, so they'll disappear within a couple of days, and there actually isn't any evidence that wavelength of UVC then would go on and lead to skin cancer. There is a less well-established safety profile for far UVC, but the evidence base is growing. So actually the first study to look at the safety of UVC in human skin was from the Photobiology Unit in Dundee. The study was carried out 2013, 2014, and then published in 2015. And it was the first in-person within subject dosed escalation study, looking to see at what dose of this far UVC did we see redness in the skin, did we see erythema? And based on the sort of previous published lab data and from other research groups, the investigators really didn't expect to see any erythema at all. So it was just going to be a small initial safety study as a precursor to a much larger sort of safety and efficacy study that was planned. But of the 4 subjects that were tested, actually erythema was found in all of them at 40 to 50 millijoules per centimetre squared. Just to put that in context, the exposure limits of far UVC are about 23 millijoules per centimetre squared. So it is about double that, twice the exposure limit, but an order of magnitude too low in order to have a bactericidal effect, which was thought to be around a few hundred millijoules per centimetre squared. And then also in that study, the volunteers were biopsied and they found DNA damage, not just in the layers of the skin above the basal layer, but actually in the basal layer itself, which is important because that's where DNA damage might then lead to mutation and replication, and which then means a sort of skin cancer concern potentially. So the results of that study really stopped any further investigation, and they were a bit puzzling because they were contrary to what had gone before, and indeed, as we'd later find out, contrary to what was to come. So what followed were really a series of studies in other research laboratories showing the safety of 222 nanometer far UVC light in both skin models and animal models. And as I said, it was puzzling because it was opposite to what we'd seen in the human volunteer study. So when we went into lockdown about a year ago, along with our colleagues at the University of St Andrews, they adapted their Monte Carlo radiative transfer computer simulations to look at light penetration in tissue, in skin, and we sought to sort of try and find out why there was that discrepancy. What we discovered was the far UVC lamp that was used in that original human study, yes, it had the main emission peak at 222 nanometers, but there was also some longer wavelength UVC, UVB, and UVA radiation. And it was those longer wavelengths which can penetrate further into the skin. And although they only accounted for about 3% of the lamp's total emission, they were causing the vast majority of the DNA damage that we were seeing. So this was in contrast to the lamps that were being used in the skin models and the animal models, because they were not showing the same damage, and they had all used a far UVC lamp which had filters in place which reduced those longer wavelengths. So in order to sort of test our hypothesis that it was these longer wavelengths causing erythema, we were able to undertake some self-exposures with a filtered far UVC source. And what we found was that there were no visible changes in the skin, even at really high exposures. So we saw no erythema at all. We saw no redness in any of the self-exposure doses, which went up as high as 18,000 millijoules per centimetre squared. We did see some yellowing of the skin at doses of about 6,000 millijoules per centimetre squared. That yellowing did seem to disappear if the skin was tape stripped, which suggests that whatever was going on was happening in the stratum corneum. But really, that's part of our research, is to continue to look into that. But if you remember from the previous study, the unfiltered lamp showed erythema at 40 to 50 millijoules per centimetre squared, and the exposure limit is 23 millijoules per centimetre squared. So really, those large doses were significantly higher with the filtered system, and were showing no visible skin changes, which is why I had said earlier there is actually potential that the current exposure limits might be increased in the future. And when we looked at the DNA damage in the skin, we found that the cyclobutane pyrimidine dimers, this form of DNA damage with the filtered far UVC sources, there was only just a small amount of these CPDs just below the stratum corneum, which is the non-proliferating skin cells. And you can see them highlighted with the arrows here in the image. And that was for a dose of 6,000 millijoules per centimeter squared, so far, far in excess of what any daily exposure limit would be. And to put that DNA damage in the context of sort of daylight exposure, again, we went back to the Monte Carlo computer models and tried to estimate the time that would be required by these far UVC lamps in order to produce the same DNA damage as you would get from 10 minutes in summer daylight. So if we focus on the data from Oxford, which is on the right-hand side of this table, and if the far UVC lamps are limited to the current exposure limits, then it would take 261 hours with a filtered far UVC source to produce the same number of CPDs as 10 minutes of daylight. And that's at the top of the epidermis. But of course, the big advantage of far UVC is that it doesn't penetrate far in the skin. So it's not the top of the epidermis that is where the biggest benefit comes from. It's the basal layer, where it's the most important to avoid that DNA damage. And in the basal layer, it would take over 30,000 hours of far UVC to produce the same number of CPDs as just 10 minutes of daylight exposure. The daylight exposure was a UV index of 4, which typically we achieve in the UK between spring and autumn. Now, the model also doesn't account for all of the repair mechanisms, which obviously go on in the body as well. So actually that 30,000 hours is probably an underestimate. But again, this is just a computer model, and the results in the past 2 slides were only from 2 individuals. So they were very small numbers. So there's clearly a need for a more robust and controlled study. And we're fortunate enough, we've also been funded to undertake that study. Which we're doing in collaboration with SHARE and TASC and TCTU and the Tayside Biorepository and Pathology. And there are going to be 2 phases to the study. The first is going to be a sort of dose escalation study, similar to that original study that we conducted. But this time we're going to go with a filtered far UVC source and higher doses. And then in the second phase, we're going to try and replicate the continuous low dose exposure of how the lamp would kind of be used or how it's envisaged to be used in normal day-to-day life. We're still in the very, very early stages of planning, but hopefully we'll get started with recruitment in the summer. Now, because obviously the photobiology unit is part of dermatology, our focus has been on the skin. And I think it's probably fair to say there's been more skin research than skin safety research than eye safety research done on this technology. But there is one published study demonstrating no corneal damage in rats from doses of up to 600 millijoules per centimeter squared. Columbia University has also just finished a 60-week chronic exposure of mice. And although they've not published the results yet, we know the researchers, and they have told us that suggesting that there's no eye or skin damage visible. I've also seen a clinical trials registry entry where they plan to test far UVC on human eyes in vivo. So we're expecting there to be more published results available sort of in the coming year. I'm also aware of a centre in Florida who are actually using the far UVC to treat corneal ulcers. And I've seen that they've some abstracts published for conferences, but there isn't actually anything in the sort of published literature yet, so we don't know a great deal about that. Abide Kusha from ophthalmology is helping us understand the eye literature and guiding us with some experiments that we've been trying to do ex vivo on animal eyes. So the eye research, yeah, it's not as complete as the skin literature, but it's definitely an encouraging picture. Now, very rightly, much of the safety research has focused on the direct damage to skin and eyes. However, there's very little, if anything, on the sort of indirect effects. I throw this out there to be deliberately controversial because I'm not sure we've ever lived in, you know, if this technology were to be widespread sort of throughout society, what effect would living in a sterile or semi-sterile environment actually have? And are we setting ourselves up for all sorts of sort of problems that we haven't even thought about yet. And this hasn't really received any attention so far. So it would be great if anybody wanted to get in touch, if you have any ideas on possible consequences, particularly useful if you actually would like to lead some of the research in this area. And indeed we've built up this East of Scotland sort of research collaboration where, you know, we can offer support and help. And that really comes to the end of what I wanted to speak about: safety. So we've heard about efficacy, and we know the benefit. We've heard about safety. So I guess it's now a risk-benefit analysis. So I'd be interested again in your opinion on a couple of things. So this is another on the Menti system, free text entry. So from what you've heard, I appreciate it's only been sort of 30 minutes and we've crammed a lot in and certainly haven't covered everything. But from what you've heard, what do you think, what's your opinion on the risk benefit of far UVC? Do you think it's a great technology that we should deploy it kind of everywhere right now, get rid of all the viruses and bacteria? Or, you know, yes, it's important. Okay, we don't have all the evidence, but you know, the risks of the pandemic far outweigh the potential of those sort of unknown risks of far UVC. And or do you think really it's too much of a gamble, and it's not yet been effective, and really we don't know what the health effects or otherwise might be from it? Yeah, some great answers coming in there. I like the should be used in pandemic times, not regularly. I think that's, yeah, absolutely. I guess you come into a social problem there. How do you, you know, if you have these installed in all your buildings, how do you leave them switched off for 10, 20 years and then only switch them on when you get to, you know, there's an interesting sort of social side to this. I wonder if I can scroll down there. Yeah, great. So I think it seems like most people are on the higher benefit than risk, maybe only in the specific kind of COVID or pandemic, epidemic times. Hospitals, yeah, absolutely. Hospital settings, very specialized use, absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, this last one on ethical issues. So that brings me to the next question, which I'd really be interested in, and this is the final question. And this comes to the ethical issue. So if you had, would you have far UVC in your home, or would you be happy if it was installed in your child's school? It's a simple yes/no question this time. Okay, answers still coming in. So it's an interesting split. We're sitting around maybe 2/3 yes, 1/3 no. And I think really that's a sort of a good point to kind of stop and kind of ponder that question. And you know, with introducing any new technology, there are moral and ethical questions that have to be answered, and there will definitely be a potential resistance to the technology as well. We have already seen there a sort of a third of people who wouldn't want it in their home or wouldn't want it in their child's school. So there's definitely it could be a challenge if the research continues to be very encouraging. So I just want to finally then acknowledge all of our collaborators, particularly those who are in the sort of East of Scotland collaboration that we've got going, but also our partners at Columbia University in New York and at the University of Leeds. And once again, thanks to the manufacturers for loaning and donating their lamps to us. And finally, thank you all for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions if we've still got time, but you can also contact me by email if there's anything. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stuart. That's really fantastic. Really interesting stuff. I have to admit to being somewhat skeptical when UV light was proposed as a great thing for COVID, when it was suggested, 8 to 10 months ago, and images of the New York subway shining disco lights around the place, and images in my head of nightclubs in the 90s. But I think you persuaded me certainly that there is something here for definite. And and I think what came across to me is that it's not necessarily the answer right now, and that this technology needs to be nuanced a little bit, and there is more research required. But what great strides have been made in this area in the last 12 months, which is so much the case for for so much of medicine and science, isn't it? You think about the vaccines, but this is another area which we wouldn't have even thought about. Or I wouldn't, at least. A couple of questions that have come through, and I've got a couple of questions as well, but we'll go with Aaron Taylor, who has said, do you see UVC technology being used more widely in the future for hospital disinfection, e.g. fitting theatres, ward areas with UVC bulbs, and what do you think is needed for this to be implemented?
Yeah, so interestingly, from some of our colleagues in America, it was commonplace in theatres in the 80s. It was, UVC was quite commonly used. So I think it depends on the purpose. So if it's for surface decontamination, there's that technology already exists. And you've probably seen the videos of these self-driving robots that can drive around themselves and illuminate rooms. And there are good UK manufacturers that exist for that. But the learning very early on was that it's not a replacement. That it will only, if I remember the numbers rightly, if it's used by itself, it will only decontaminate about 20 to 30%. You have to put in the cleaning first, and then an extra 20. You get an extra 20% on top of that. And theatres are a great place for it to be used because they're generally not cluttered with objects. So the problem is the UV light can only decontaminate what it touches. And if you've got shadows being created by objects within the room so that it can't get to, say, under a bed or behind a television, then those places will still have. But theatres, I think theatres is a good use of it.
Excellent. I'm a fan of American football, and the NFL have put out loads of videos of them sterilizing or disinfecting areas around the football stadia with ultraviolet lights. And I did think, would it not be easier just to wipe it all down with a wet cloth and some chlorine-based disinfectant? But anyway, next question. There's a few commenting on how your excellent use of Mentimeter, and I have to admit, I thought that was great. Really engaging using all those different the different facilities. And then Sarah Martins de Silva from the Assisted Conception Unit has said, we filter out blue/UV light in assisted conception unit due to negative effects on sperm, eggs, and embryos. Do you have any thoughts about UVC impact on fertility? How about that? On you go.
Yeah. So I guess on people, it shouldn't. How to say this? During intercourse, it shouldn't make any difference, I guess. But in a petri dish, so the far UVC, the whole thing about far UVC is that it won't penetrate very far. So blue light will go through a plastic. UVA will go through a plastic, will go through glass. And so can impact on anything that's in a test tube or in a petri dish or that type of thing. The far UVC gets absorbed so superficially that unless it's sort of completely open to the air, which is unlikely to be, it's probably not an issue.
Righty-ho, that's good to know. Okay, my question is around, and I have no reason for you to be able to answer this question at all. It's perhaps more of a comment. I was going to talk about ventilation, and then you brought it up anyway in one of your slides. I think it's the thing that's not discussed at all, really, is ventilation for reducing risk. Yet there's some pretty good evidence about air changes, and we in respiratory and ID and infection control spend a lot of time worrying about number of air changes within it. But what we don't talk about is keeping windows open and airflow in schools and airflow in small rooms and everything. It was interesting that your study as a baseline was 6 air changes an hour, and I'm not sure that any of us are sat in a room right now that has 6 air changes per hour. So what do you think is more important, ventilation or some UVC lamps on the roof?
Yeah, so as you've kind of hinted at, they're closely linked to each other. So we have had to learn a bit about ventilation, and in the process of looking at this. I mean, the great thing about ventilation is that there's no risk, or there's hardly, certainly if you're not in a polluted area, you get fresh air into the room. Brilliant. So ventilation, I would say, when it's easy to do, is first line. We purchased a few CO2 detectors for the department, and certainly actually in photobiology, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the ventilation is really good in the department. The CO2 levels don't really ever get above 800 parts per million. And I think they say good is below 1,000 or 1,200 parts per million. So I think that the ventilation in the hospital, I don't know if this obviously, I don't know if this is true throughout the hospital, but I think the ventilation in the hospital is actually pretty good. But there are circumstances whereby it's not possible to increase ventilation, either because the air handling unit can't do it, or because if you try to introduce more air from outside, you reduce the temperature, because actually a lot of the ventilation systems rely on recirculating air to maintain temperature, particularly obviously during the winter months. And in those circumstances, or if it's too expensive, or it requires a huge change to your building, then UV can be really useful. But certainly I would think going forward, new builds, that those levels of ventilation should absolutely be built into the fabric of the building. It was Florence Nightingale's papers. I think the first page, she talks about the importance of having fresh airflow around patients. We've known about ventilation for an incredibly long time, and like you say, it seems to, particularly because of this need to be energy efficient. So our houses have become energy efficient, but they've also become less well ventilated as a result of that. So it's trying to get that balance right.
Thanks so much. There's a comment from Katie Hans in hematology. A comment rather than a question. Research is ongoing to see if and how UVC can be used for pathogen inactivation of platelet components. So there's another potentially really helpful utility of UVC. Sally, anything to add before I sign us away?
No, I think Ewan's very comprehensively covered it. I think we just wanted to convey that it's an area of active interest, which actually, would not replace other aspects of anti-corona attack, if you like, but they would sort of supplement, in terms of supplementing vaccination programs, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I think Ewan's very comprehensively covered it.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think you asked an interesting question at the end there, Ewan, of would you be happy for it to be in your home or your child's school? And the free text comments about where did we think this would go? I think it's the idea of in high risk times, high prevalence, clinic waiting rooms, areas that are not so well ventilated, or where you're putting vulnerable people in a single space. Outside my door and turn right is the outpatient area in East Block, and I think that that would be a really good place to employ it, and you could have it turned on and turned off, and in high risk areas. I think that's something that's really interesting to look into. Yeah. Okay, right. Well, then we're done. So we've used up 55 minutes. That's been an interesting discussion and a fantastic presentation from both of you. Thank you so much for coming along and presenting. Thanks you to the 40 people who've been along today, and the rest of the everyone else can watch this on the YouTube channel, which I'll link to in the comments, or just search for Dundee Grand Rounds on YouTube. You can link, you can subscribe, you can like, you can click the wee bell to get notifications. So next week, I'm on holiday. So Leslie is going to be chairing, and it's Alex Doney who's going to speak about precision medicine and the research that's going on in Memo to use it to looking into precision medicine. So have a good weekend. I'll see you in a couple of weeks, and thanks again to our speakers. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Bye.